May 4th, 2004, an episode of Static Shock released dealing with the advent of school shootings. That episode was released over 22 years ago as I record this video in 2024. And yet, school shootings and incidents like that are more prevalent than ever. And if you don't believe me, the school year just started in 2024. And so far, there have been 29 school shootings with injuries or death. 12 people have been killed, and 58 at minimum were injured. 6 of them being adults or school employees, and the other 6 being dead children. I would argue that this episode of Static Shock is more pertinent now than it has ever been. And with that being the opening message of the video, I also would like to clarify a few things. I, personally, will not be making a single cent off of this video. I don't feel comfortable profiting off of a topic like this, especially not in the way in which I go about making my content. I remember watching this episode of Static Shock when I was a child growing up. Granted, the episode was made before I was even born, and yet I remember watching it. I remember being in school when we first started to institute fighting back and being defensive, in which we would hide in the classroom holding makeshift weapons. I was in about the 5th grade when I remember doing this for the first time in school, and I was always very confused as to why. I had seen this episode of Static Shock previously, but to me as a child, I never made the connection that this could potentially happen in real life. I want to keep the summary of the episode fairly brief and short, and then I want to discuss both the benefits and the issues that I have with this episode. The episode Jimmy starts off with our titular characters of Static Shock and Richie observe one of their classmates being bullied. And so Static and Richie, being the good people they are, they attempt to spend time with him, hoping to sort of make him feel more welcome at their school, especially with the bullying being constant. But in that time in which Richie and Static spend with Jimmy, they come to realize that he is in possession of a gun, but Static decides not to report this at all. Eventually, the bullying gets to be far too much for Jimmy to handle, and so he escalates the situation into which he decides to bring a handgun to school. Now, what made this episode in my mind so memorable was that throughout a majority of kids' TV shows, when guns were shown, they were laser pistols, they were fakes, they were not real. When I watched this episode, the gun was real, and I think that stuck out to me a lot growing up. Jimmy ultimately does not shoot anyone on purpose, but accidentally discharges the firearm at Richie, a character we have known for the past 2 seasons of Static Shock. And honestly, I was surprised at which they chose to shoot him as a kid. Looking back on it, the episode telegraphs this extremely well. I was also surprised by the complete and utter lack of Static, at least growing up. Now, seeing it, I understand why they chose to do this, and why they chose to show us the episode through Virgil's eyes, allowing us to see that not even superheroes can be everywhere at once and stop events like this from happening. There's also talk about the personal responsibility that Virgil feels, whether that guilt be justified or not. Survivor's guilt is a real thing, especially when you felt like you could have done something in that situation. Static was presented with a few options in which he could have. He could have reported seeing Jimmy with the gun. He could have thrown on his costume or used his powers earlier, and he could have stopped this. At least that's what Virgil feels like he could have done. And honestly, from an episode standpoint, I think it's a good thing that none of that transpired. It would have felt less real and less authentic that way, and that's something I praise Static Shock for a lot. Putting this entire episode in Virgil's eyes was the correct call from the creative team, even if I don't think it was handled perfectly. My whole point in bringing this episode up, and even bothering to discuss it in a video like this, is because, simply put, we failed a child like Jimmy. We failed them outright. Oftentimes, when we're having issues in school, our parents will tell us to do one of two things. We're either going to go contact the administration of the school, in which, in my personal experience, and the experience I've seen of the people around me, does absolutely nothing. Administration doesn't do anything. They simply might suspend the kid, and the kid comes back and he does it all over again. Not much really changes on that regard. And on the other hand, a lot of people like to tell your kid to fight back against the bullies, to grow a backbone. Sometimes I think, especially in young minds such as Jimmy's, this idea and message is misconstrued, especially when we, as Americans, breed a culture of toting guns and defending our land with violence and force through means of firearms. I'm not saying directly anybody would tell their kid to go shoot their bully at school, but I'm simply saying that in a lot of media and in a lot of the times that we see, whether in commercials or at least in my experience from growing up in the Deep South, is that a lot of people like to handle their problems through their weapons, whether that be a means of intimidation or a means of getting rid of the problem. To mention the fact that we hand children toy guns constantly. Nerf, one of the brands I remember growing up and absolutely loving, is that their entire profit margin comes off of selling fake guns to kids so that they can shoot each other with it. They have been recording record profits recently in the United States, having had over $300 million in the US compared to only $100 million last year. And Nerf seems especially popular in America. You could chalk that up to it being an American company and being owned by Hasbro, but you could also chalk it up to the fact that American kids are far more interested in having fake firearms, and parents are much more willing to give that to their kids rather than, say, other countries are willing to do so. Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but I can definitely see that we in America put heavier emphasis on giving our children fake toy weapons, specifically guns, more than just about any other developed nation out there. I think that says a lot. And when you expose a young mind to something like this, someone who is not fully developed, we can often run into problems and issues like this. But I also have my own issues with this episode of Static Shock personally. For example, they seem to pin all of Jimmy wanting to perform this action on his bullying, which isn't really true nor indicative of real life. That's not how things work a majority of the time, especially in the real world. It's really not how it works at all. I get that it's easier to present the information that way, especially to kids, but I feel in trying to dumb down the message for children, we lost an important part of nuance that we simply don't see. For example, in the Appalachian high school shooting that just most recently happened in Georgia, one that I would assume most Americans will be familiar with due to the fact that it just recently happened. The kid had showed signs of mental illness and a want to do the act that he ended up going through with. Colt Gray had posted on his social media in 2023 about shooting up his school. And despite all of that, and despite getting expelled from his school, not only was he allowed back, but his father thought it would be a good idea to buy the gun that Colt ended up using in the school shooting and give it to Colt as a Christmas present. This episode really does miss the nuances of the things that happen, because it truly is never that simple. And even despite this episode's flaws and faults, I still personally believe that it had a good message behind it, and they were trying their best to provide some sort of creative outlet. Now, Static did provide statistics at the end of the episode during his PSA, but I could not verify the validity of these statistics, and especially considering how far removed we are, it would be extremely difficult to track down the exact numbers or compare them to today's numbers, for example. And so I don't want to use these statistics because I want to keep the facts of this video as factual as possible, while trying my best to separate them from my own personal opinions. Regardless, tragedies like these happen every single day, even if the news doesn't want to report on it every day. On September 17th, a 14-year-old boy was injured in the school parking lot at Washington Technical Magnet School in St. Paul, Minneapolis. I didn't even know about this until I started doing research for this video. As of recording this, that was only a few days ago. Every single week, every day, it feels like there are more and more violent threats made about school, and every other week it feels like we see another school shooting in the news or one that simply just didn't get reported on. This isn't a fact of life, especially not in a first world country in an extremely developed nation that we claim to be constantly. This should never be a fact of life. It shouldn't even be considered to be one of those. We hold the record as the #1 country in the world for school shootings. That's not something to be proud of. Last year in 2023, we had 346. That is the highest recorded total since 1966 in the entire world. Something is fundamentally wrong, and it's on us. It's on us for sitting idly by and pretending that, these things just happen. It's on us for not taking the time, effort, and resources and pouring them into children like Jimmy, into children like Colt, because you don't just wake up one day and decide you want to shoot up your school. That's not how that works at all. I want to make it clear that I don't feel sympathy for the actions that these people have chosen to take, but I do feel sympathy for how they ended up getting there, and the things that led them down that path, whether or not it might have been helped by their parents, by mental illness, or simply by themselves. We as a society can't seem to point to exactly what the root cause of this issue is, and that's what makes it even worse. I shouldn't have to worry about when my brother goes to school every single day that he might get shot in some sort of horrific school shooting. No one should have to worry if it is their cousin, brother, sister, or loved one of any kind should be in any sort of harm at schools. Schools should be a place for children to be safe and to be cared for, all the way up and through high school. Teachers should not have to run active shooter drills in which they have to huddle their second and third graders in rooms and tell them that they have to fight for their lives. Imagine trying to explain that to a child. I don't have the answers. I'll be honest with all of you. I genuinely don't. I wish I did, but there is no simple band-aid solution to this, unfortunately. The best I can give each and every one of you is to ask that you become active in your own personal community. That's the only way change will happen in any sort of fashion or function. Whether you want to peacefully protest, march in the streets, I would also recommend going to your local school board and voting on issues there. That is beyond important. Vote for what you believe in. It's part of what's supposed to make democracy great. I wish this were simpler. I wish I had the fucking answers. I wish I lived in a damn comic book sometimes, but there is no Superman, there's no Batman, there's no Static Shock who's gonna come and save us and swoop us away from these problems. This is real life, unfortunately. I believe comic books, movies, TV shows, they're all at their best when they tackle real life issues and problems. And I still believe that, but when we don't have an answer, it kind of sucks. I hope that you all, take something positive from this video. I hope you all get active in your communities, and not just for a day or for a week, but for the rest of your lives. Because it's easy to get that motivation to do this for a week, maybe 2 weeks, but after a while it gets boring and tiresome, it becomes hard. I would just encourage that you find the wherewithal, if you truly care about this issue, to not let it beat down on you. I'm gonna try my best to not let it do that, and that's why I wanted to make this video. I don't have all the answers, but I'm hoping one day we will.